Okay, so why don't we get started with the next session. I hope everybody enjoyed the lunch and the address by Chief Justice Seitz. Our next session, Corporate Governance and Proxy Development, is being led by Lily Brown, a partner at WilmerHale. Lily is co-chair of the Corporate Governance and Disclosure Group and the Corporate Practice Group at Wilmer. In her work, Lily advises clients, including public companies and their boards, on federal securities law, compliance, and corporate governance matters. Before joining WilmerHale in 2013, Lily served in several capacities in the SEC's Division of Corporation Finance, including as Senior Special Counsel in the Office of Mergers and Acquisitions and as counsel to the Division Director. Lily almost single-handedly wrote the proxy access rule, so if you ever have questions about the rule, which obviously has been vacated,
Nice.
that was Lily. Lily, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Notwithstanding that last bit, Tom is one of my favorite people and I think has just done a fantastic job chairing this program, so kudos to Tom. So welcome all to the Corporate Governance and Proxy Developments panel. We'll be going through some of the key themes and developments that are impacting the 2023 proxy season and that will continue to. And we're going to focus on trying to kind of give you practical takeaways and advice as you all are navigating this ever-changing landscape, both public companies and your advisors. First, I'm going to introduce, not loud enough? All right. Better? Better? Oh, it's for you? Okay. Sorry. Hi. Okay, first that was Crystal. I'm about to introduce her. First, let me quickly introduce my wonderful panel. Full bios are available online. So right here next to me, the person I tried to steal the microphone from is Crystal Brini, a partner at PJT Camberview in San Francisco. Ade Heiliger is a partner in the public companies practice at Weil Gotshal in DC. Kate Kelly is Vice President, Deputy General Counsel, and Corporate Secretary at Meta Platforms, Inc. And Colleen McIntosh is Senior Vice President, Chief Governance Officer, and Corporate Secretary for CVS Health. I went alphabetical, so I jumped around, but you get the picture. Each of these folks is incredibly accomplished and brings a lot of expertise and a practical approach to this topic. I will point out that each of these panelists is also extremely busy at this time of year, so I'm extra grateful that they were able to skip some sleep to be here today. So, corporate governance in the annual meeting season. This is the topic of the hour and a little bit that we have together. This is always a fascinating space because there are so many different inputs and constituencies and other considerations that go into it, even more so these days. It also makes it a very challenging space, so there's a lot to talk about. I will note up front that the SEC has been pretty active in stepping into this space as well. You've heard from various SEC staffers throughout the program. They're active in rulemaking, interpretive guidance, reviews of public company filings, and enforcement activity. And among other things, we have seen that the SEC staff changes from November 2021, I guess, that played out in the 2022 proxy season have resulted in significantly more proposals ending up in company proxies and going to a vote. So this has really changed the landscape, not just for public companies, but also for the institutional investors who have to make voting decisions on all of these proposals. So it's just a really different landscape and continuing to change. Every season it feels like it's continuations of trends, but a little tweaks around the edges. So all of this is to say there's a lot to talk about, and we hope today is helpful as folks prepare for this proxy season that we are pretty much in the throes of, I think, prep for. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Ade to get us started on some new and not new, but still interesting developments impacting proxies and annual meetings in 2023.
Great, thanks, Lily. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. Great to be to meet and speak with all of you today. So we're going to start with kind of what's new for this year's proxy season. I think the technical answer is all of it. Like everything is new. Like it's all new. I know we say every year that oh, there's a lot new this year to cover, and every year I think we mean it too. But this year
really mean it every year.
We really mean it this year because it's all new this year. So, I mean, just to kind of tick off a few things that that we've noted here. There's pay for performance, which which has been talked about, yesterday as well too. That'll probably be the most challenging of the new items to implement this year. There's universal proxy cards, the implementation of that, what that means, the implementation of not just the proxy rules, but changes to the cards themselves in contested and non-contested elections. There's a whole host of shareholder proposals driven by, the ESG proposals, the SEC's stance with respect to certain exclusion on certain substantive grounds. Activism plays into that, the accompanying impact on the universal proxy card and what that means for shareholder proposals as well too. There's board leadership and oversight risk. There's, as we'll discuss later, there has been additional scrutiny and disclosure requests with respect to board leadership structures and risk oversight. And then what else we have? Board diversity, composition, and risk. Again, calls for diversity board diversity coming from sort of different avenues. We saw sort of headwinds against some of the state initiatives on board diversity, but that's been more than made up for in other areas such as ISS and Glass-Lewis policies, NASDAQ diversity rules, which come into play, institutional investors and their engagement priorities. Shareholder proposals, as I mentioned, is another avenue for increased diversity. And then the SEC itself has, on its 2023 regulatory agenda, corporate board diversity as an item as well too. And I think kind of with that, in addition to some of the other items that I mentioned, the activism, et cetera, and such, there's more play and more requests for disclosure with respect to board composition and skills, which we'll get into as well too. Then what else we have? Say on frequency, I should say. For many companies, that'll be coming up again this year. For companies who adopted it in 2017, they're up to your 6 years are up again. And then the format of meetings, which is something that we've seen since the pandemic, the shift from in-person to hybrid to virtual and what that means. So that's just a few of the new items, which is, it's a pretty extensive list. So buckle up.
So we're going to be coming back to several of these over the next hour, but why don't we for now kind of flip over first to Colleen and then Kate, our in-house folks who are really actually doing all of this stuff right now, for some kind of nuts and bolts of what you think about in planning an annual meeting and preparing your proxy, and how is this year different, assuming it is?
Thanks, Lily. So I guess it's always different, right? Every year has its own flavor about what we're doing. And this year, I think we started with a lot of education for our board and the committees because there was so much that was new. And starting out to, explain some of the new disclosures. We start our shareholder engagement process, pretty much the same way every year, look at the results from last year. We look at, who our holders are. We wait for the 13Fs to come out in August and then decide our strategy going in. This year we had to think about what do we really want to engage on? Is there anything in particular to talk about? And we had a new strategy, we have new leadership, we had board changes last year that were in our proxy. So we thought that we would start with that. And what I found as we went through our engagement process was that it really was a lot of conversation about governance. So we brought that back to the board as well to think about as we plan for the annual meeting, how do we think about bringing you to life in the proxy and really explaining why each and every one of you is right for our company. They're all extraordinary people and leaders and bring different views and skills, but how do we really explain when we look at our strategy and align the skills to our strategy, what is it about you that makes you right? So we've been focused on that. It's been an interesting dialogue with them as we've even turned the question around to them to say, you tell us why you think you're the right director for our board, and what are your experiences that we should highlight? We've been engaging with particularly our nominating committee on that.
I would echo everything Colleen said, and then perhaps also add, in addition to all of the disclosure, shareholder engagement, and the proxy, I think for some companies, even just the decision around what to do with the annual meeting this year may be one that's also coming to the forefront. We've had a number of years of hybrid meetings or even just virtual only meetings because of the pandemic, and then knowing that there's still this push to try to get back in person. For companies who were virtual only last year, I think there is a question on the table as to whether or not you want to do virtual again this year, hybrid this year, or even go back in person. And for those doing either a hybrid or particularly the virtual only, trying to make sure that those shareholders who are able to participate virtually have a similar experience as best as they can to those that are in the room. And I think just being able to balance that and think through it. Planning has to start 5 or 6 months in advance, so it's something to start just talking about internally, talking about with the board, so that you've got the time to plan for what that annual meeting experience is, even as you're just starting to work through the disclosures and the proxy.
So one of the things that's kind of interesting in that space is the discussion around format has really changed over the last few years. I think before the pandemic, there was significant concern that virtual meetings were a way to kind of cut off access for shareholders, to the board, to management. And of course, everyone kind of took a pause during the pandemic. It was what it was. And coming out of it, I think you see a lot more acknowledgement that it can be beneficial. Investors are able to go to more meetings, not the travel. You might be able to go to multiple meetings in a day. So it is kind of an interesting conversation, and folks are trying to decide, are we going to stay this way? Are we going to go back to in-person? Are we going to do hybrid, which is, I remember talking to you at one point, and what did you describe it as a very stressful prom or something? How did you describe the event planning that goes into a meeting?
Yeah, it's part party planning. Is
very
part
stressful
of
party planning. Yeah. And so you would be, in essence, kind of doing both of those things. So it's interesting to see how that discussion has changed, and I think everyone kind of is making different decisions, but I don't feel like there's kind of the angst around virtual only that we did see before. And people have gotten good at it, right?
Yeah, I mean, the technology's been improving year after year, and I think that there's just a recognition of trying to bring more of that in-person experience, or even just the engagement and back and forth experience, into a virtual meeting. So I think more to come, and see where this can evolve over the next couple of years too.
Okay, so turning to Crystal, so how do you see kind of the ESG landscape? Did we get this far into it without using the term ESG? I think we might have. How is the ESG landscape, which is omnipresent, of course, changing, and how is it kind of impacting this proxy and annual meeting season? How do you see companies dealing with it?
Yeah, well, I would say that it's getting more complex and even more sticky, I'd say, than in past years. And I think there's a lot of dynamics at play across all the different constituents. If you think about corporates, investors, some of the pressure groups, some of the shareholder proponents. But I think as you think about what's really driving some of the actions that we're going to see this year, there's a few things that I would highlight. And that is the pressure on companies around some of the really highly politicized issues out there, and the engagement around those issues. If you take things like reproductive rights, gun control, and while there is very clear pressure on companies around that, I think what's really under the surface is the pressure then therefore applied on the investors, and what that is changing across the dialogue between investors and companies. And this is one of the things, you're starting to see investors want to engage with companies around these issues for how they're navigating, how they're tackling them, because they themselves are then trying to develop their own views on what should be in scope, out of scope, and be able to answer some of the questions that are coming this way. So I think this is one thing that really goes through a number of constituents in the space. The other thing, which is probably not going to be a surprise to anybody here, is around the anti-ESG movement, and I think further pressure around the larger asset managers and how they're classifying ESG funds, how they're defining what is material. And I think we've seen even more so recently a real spotlight on particularly the large asset managers, but asset managers in particular, to really define ESG. And I think you're seeing some of the changes come out with the policy changes we're seeing from some of the bigger investors you're not seeing maybe as much pushing of the envelope. You're not seeing as much focus on the term ESG. I mean, it's probably telling that we didn't get to it until 10 minutes into this. But what you are seeing is a really coalescing around what are the core issues that they're seeing as material. And those are the areas where they're a little bit more narrowly focused, and they're really pushing those as opposed to the broader umbrella ESG terms and expanding the dialogue there. I think one of the counter pressures I would say that we're seeing relative to the anti-ESG funds is the underlying asset owners. So the underlying asset owners of these large asset managers are still by and large, now there are some exceptions, by and large really pushing on this front. And so I kind of give this backdrop around the investors and the pressures that they're getting from all sides as they're going into this proxy season in what is, rather politically charged, and there's a lot of eyes on them. And the one other thing that I would be remiss not to mention, it's not pressure around ESG, but some of the pressure on large asset managers right now due to their size and influence. And so BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street have all either rolled out or reiterated some of their programs that allow voter choice. And so what that means is they are creating the ability for underlying asset owners to drive their own votes. Now, this is early days. I think the impact of it is still rather limited, but it's something that we're watching really closely, because I think as more underlying asset owners take control of their own votes, it makes engagement between companies and their investors harder. There's going to be a disaggregation there, and so being able to go to a Vanguard and know that you're talking to a 6, 7, 8, 9, 10% shareholder, there's going to be some disaggregation of that ownership, and there are going to be more investors to have to contact and engage. The other potential unintended consequence of this is increasing influence of the proxy advisors. So as asset owners take control of their votes, if they're not voting on it, it's a rather labor-intensive process. And so if they are not creating their own policies and executing that voting, the likelihood that you could see them signing up to an ISS or a Glass Lewis subscription or the like, maybe with some tweaks, not to say that it would be the regular ISS policy, but I think the likelihood that some of that happens is also there. So I share that as a little bit more of a coming attraction as opposed to something that I think is really going to impact this season. I think there's already enough to navigate this season. Save that for another one.
Fair enough.
And Linda, can I add one thing? So I know, Crystal, you hit on this. One of the other things that we're hearing very specifically from investors is that with the ESG pressure on them to be transparent, some of them are really coming and they really want to be able to then show, okay, we caused or we were able to push a company to do X, and then we can report this back and disclose it in our report that we have to now produce. And so I think that additional transparency reporting requirements on the investor side is definitely also just increasing the dialogue, increasing the number of asks on companies that we have to then navigate through.
Absolutely. It's a whole nother layer, right? I mean, I'd like to think that everybody always does their homework, but now they need to show their homework and make it public to everybody, right? And so there's another level of scrutiny and review that I think comes with that. You're absolutely right.
Excellent. Okay, we're going to move into another kind of a key area in this space. And before I turn it back to Crystal, we're going to stay with Crystal to kind of tell us some of the themes we're seeing. I will say, over the years, as we've talked about 14A shareholder proposals on these panels, I always kind of felt it was important to say, okay, not all of you get shareholder proposals, but even, why is it important to those of you who don't? And it's because it's a good way to kind of know what institutional investors are focused on. You may ultimately get one, but it's just a good trend area. And we are definitely seeing these directly impact more and more public companies, even those who historically have not gotten them. And we see it a lot with the ESG proposals. I've certainly seen plenty of clients over the last couple of years get their first ever shareholder proposal, and it's not on, kind of some of the governance topics that historically would be the first proposal someone would get, but going kind of straight to DEI or other ESG, E&S topics. So this is a space I continue to say, even if you don't get them, it's still an important way to kind of know where some of these trends are arising. But I guess I think that's probably not the case for as many of you as it was historically. But I'll flip to the next slide and back to Crystal.
Great. Well, we came off a record year last year, which is the sheer number of shareholder proposals, and I think by all accounts, at least what I can see, what we talked about as a panel, I think we're heading towards another one this year, just in terms of the number of shareholder proposals that were filed. But if we rewind to proxy season 2021 and just think about what we learned coming out of that to apply to this year. We saw a lot more focus, particularly around climate and emissions proposals. They doubled. They doubled last year, but I would not say that their success doubled. You really saw a divergence in some of these proposals, and the reason I say this is I think we're likely heading down a similar path, where many of these proposals fall into two camps. There's those that are well targeted and designed to be things that the largest asset managers might support. And then there are others that are really, really prescriptive, and you saw that divergence last year in some of the vote totals. Those that were really prescriptive, the support for those proposals really fell off, and so I think that's one of the areas that we're watching very closely. The devil is certainly in the details for all of the emissions proposals. The other thing that I think is worth highlighting, because I think it does give a sense of where we're going to see more focus from shareholder proposals, is I would say it was a real breakout year for a couple of proposals. Concealment clauses. It was a relatively new proposal. They got tremendous support for the first year. And typically, when you see that, you see a lot of follow-on actors. Where proponents see things are highly successful, adopting some of those issues, and so we're expecting to see more of those. It was also a really big year for racial equity audits. They really expanded into civil rights audits. There are now a number of companies undertaking those audits, and I think this is one of the few issues that, even as you think about the large asset managers and where their policies are going, they've been relatively supportive of these. And now this is an issue that I expect will take more shape as more companies put these audits out, and there are things for investors to react to in terms of the specifics of these proposals. But I do think that we're going to see more of that. Similar, severance pay was another shareholder proposal that got a ton of traction. We anticipate seeing more of that. This is kind of an old proposal, but it gained a lot of momentum just in last year and recent years. One of the overriding things, and I think we're going to get to this, as we talk about the panel, in the context of just a huge volume of shareholder proposals, one of the things that investors are struggling with, while there's a huge burden on companies to have to work through all of these shareholder proposals, there is also a burden on the investors in reviewing and evaluating all of these proposals. And I think one of the things that companies are hearing during off-season engagement, and we know is going to be a focus for investors in season, is they're really looking for companies to share more details, whether it's the proponent, whether it is more details around why the company doesn't think that this is in the best interest. And I think that's something to keep in mind. And I know we're going to get into some disclosure practices here, but keep it in the back of your mind, making it easy for investors to evaluate these proposals, because this burden has also really been shifted onto them as well, to be able to make sure that they have enough time to dedicate to get to the right answer on these proposals.
Excellent. I'm going to quickly go through just some of what we saw in terms of impact of the SEC's activity in this space, right? Between interpretive guidance, and there are some pending rulemakings, but right now what we have are pending proposals. What we have right now to work with from the 2022 season, or what we're kind of looking at, is what did the staff legal bulletin 14L actually do with regard to ESG proposals and just the overall process. And for those of you who are like, didn't we see a slide about this last year? Yes, this is a staff legal bulletin that's been out, but now we have the impact. We've seen a season under Staff Legal Bulletin 14L, and so we can say that there was definitely a significant impact on the changes in guidance that were conveyed through that Staff Legal Bulletin. Just as a reminder, these changes were primarily around how the staff analyzes the ordinary business exclusion, which has historically been one of the more common, and as the staff mentioned this morning, continues to be a common basis on which companies have tried to, or have historically excluded proposals, very much less so now. So the rub here is whether a proposal transcends ordinary business such that it is deemed to relate to a significant policy issue. In that case, it cannot be excluded, and basically kind of the G in ESG has kind of always fallen into that category, but the E and the S are now solidly there with it. So you really are not seeing an ability to exclude ESG proposals anymore, and we definitely saw that play out in the 2022 season, and it continues to. The staff legal guidance also addressed kind of how the staff was going to administer micromanagement, which is kind of a category of ordinary business. And again, we're definitely seeing just a pullback in terms of availability of exclusions on this basis, ordinary business. So we really have seen very, very few ESG-related proposals, including those that purport to be ESG-related. People call these different things, but I will call them anti-ESG proposals for now. So we're seeing these types of proposals also going in under the new guidance. And so we're just, very, very much, very limited ability to use ordinary business as a basis to exclude. And we're seeing many more proposals going in, including very, very prescriptive proposals. And so kind of keying off of something that Crystal said, which is that the investors who need to make voting decisions on these are encountering not only vastly more proposals that they need to come up with votes on, but also more prescriptive proposals. So we're seeing kind of a pullback and thoughtfulness in how those voting decisions get made. So I guess this is yes, what we thought it was going to do is what it happened. This was our kind of takeaway, and we're going to kind of continue to see that. I think, one of the things we heard from the staff this morning was that there are fewer no action requests in. That kind of, bears out what we expected. But anecdotally, I will say, we really do, it's just not the same landscape in terms of considering no action relief as kind of an avenue here in most cases. Procedural bases still exist, but even there we've seen some letters this season where the staff has definitely gone under the hood and kind of tightened that up as well. So I think we will just continue to see companies really considering other avenues first. I mean, there are still no action requests that go in. There are, times when a proponent will just completely not send in proof of ownership. But for the most part, it's just not one of the main avenues anymore, the way it would have been 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. So a lot of focus on engagement with proponents, seeking negotiated withdrawals, and if that doesn't work, then just kind of really making sure that you're getting your story out there. Talking to your institutional investors, being very clear about who the proponents are. If you have a proponent who is kind of in this anti-ESG space, and you're not necessarily going to be able to tell that from the proposal in all cases. So making sure that those proponents are very much clearly identified with the proposal, because that will enable the institutional investors and others to kind of understand what it is that they're looking at and make their voting decisions kind of with that information. And we've also seen Glass Lewis, in their updated policies, it's focused on identification of the proponent as well, because it kind of plays into the evaluation of the proposal. So a lot there. Kate, do you want to start us off a little bit about how you're navigating all of this?
Sure. So I think we're definitely seeing some of the trends that you've alluded to play out, both even last year and this year. The first is with the no action process. There are definitely no action letters we would have submitted in prior years that we're just not submitting this year. It doesn't seem like it's even worth it to go through that effort when it's almost certainly not going to be granted. And these would be primarily on substantial implementation and the micromanaging side. I think there are a couple of other, and even the procedural ones that should be slam dunks, we sometimes have just questions about whether they'll actually go through. And so to date, we have gotten the procedural ones that were incurable, but it is very striking that there's even a question mark in our mind that some of those that used to be just slam dunk, no action relief, they didn't provide proper ownership. There's some question about whether they'll get through the process. I think in terms of the shareholder engagement and the negotiation and withdrawal process, I've seen some really significant shifts, particularly last season and then continuing into this season. It used to be that there was really a lot of back and forth, and that there was a real middle area that we could come to resolution with shareholder proponents. And oftentimes we could successfully withdraw or receive a successful withdrawal of those proposals and continue the conversation, and oftentimes we would be implementing changes. And one of the striking things last season is that unless we agreed to absolutely everything that was in the proposal and behind the proposal, we did not get the withdrawals, even if we were doing what I thought would have been a really good substantial implementation letter. So, and then what was interesting is in the conversations with the larger institutions during the in-season engagement, they would often say, so what broke down? Why weren't you able to get to some form of resolution with these shareholders? Talk to us about your engagement. That was really, because they were looking at what we were doing and saying, how is this not getting the proposal to withdraw, or the proponent to withdraw the proposal? It seems like you're doing virtually, substantially what they're asking for. And so those are the kinds of conversations that we're having now. And I would say the two responses this year that we're trying to do more of is just make sure that the board response is as expansive and robust and detailed, just as Crystal and Lily were talking about earlier, because we aren't necessarily going to be able to have all of those conversations with all of the shareholders, and we want to make sure that people are really focused and have the information to know even as much as we can what the board and the company's response is. And then the second thing is we're focusing more even on the top shareholder engagement and knowing that that's going to be the real, the proposal is going to get in. So let's make sure that we've got everything both in the proxy, the disclosure overall, and we can have those conversations with the larger institutions if we're not successful at really having a withdrawal or a negotiated resolution with the proponent. So, and Colleen, I know you've got some additional experiences and trends you're seeing as well to share.
Yeah, very similar. I guess one thing I'd say is that our approach hasn't really changed. So even though our opportunities to file no action letters are more narrow now, our approach has always been that we would rather negotiate a withdrawal than seek no action exclusion. And if the shareholders they take the time to write the letter, it's worth our time to engage with them. And so that's always been our approach. We did avail ourselves of the no action letter process in the past where we thought it was appropriate, but we were judicious about that. So we've had a lot of conversations over the years. And by the way, if there's anybody out there who didn't get any, I want to stand next to you in that aura, because I have to go back a decade to find a proxy where I didn't have any proposals. And that just means we were successful in getting them withdrawn. So I don't know what it's like not to get one. I was lucky this year it wasn't double digits. So we do a lot of engagement. Oftentimes we know the proposals are coming, or you can sense that the proposals are coming as you're engaging with shareholders on topics. We're seeing more of an approach. They're trying to get a sense of what the industry is doing. So tell us what you're doing. They may be quite satisfied with what we're doing. Put a placeholder proposal in as they continue their discussions with others, and then see how they're going to negotiate a resolution. So it's interesting. It's a broader approach. It's not necessarily about us. It's really about the issue. I think like Kate, we're seeing some that are just, if you don't do 100%, they won't withdraw. So the 99% doesn't get us there. And some just frankly won't engage at all. And we too are having those discussions with our institutional investors about, What was the engagement like? And can you explain more of that in the opposition statements so that they get a full sense of what we tried to accomplish through that? So I guess our decisions about compromising might be different. We'll have to think about that, because if we're not comfortable with where they're pressing, right, and it's oftentimes broader than the simple proposal that's in front of you. They're asking for even more things. If we're not comfortable with that, we might just let it go to a vote, do the engagement, see if we can keep it from passing, but even if it does pass, then implement what's written rather than what in discussions they've asked for. That's different, right? And that's a strategic decision that we'll have to make. But we're still in the earlier stages. We have another 5 or 6 weeks before we have to file. So still lots of discussions to have.
I'd add to, I think that decision about what you include in the proxy around the context for it versus what you can say verbally in a meeting is, I don't envy you guys. But I do think that's absolutely what investors are looking for. And the one thing that we saw this year, we've seen a couple investors now come out very explicitly and say that they are looking at the spirit of the shareholder proposals as opposed to just the prescriptive ask in the shareholder proposals. And I think to see how this plays out, I think is going to potentially even complicate this more, right? As you think about interpreting the support levels you get and being able to parse out those that were supporting the spirit of the proposal versus exactly what was in there. And what you were saying, where you're getting so close but can't get them to withdraw, and then to have investors supporting the spirit of it is just going to complicate this further.
I do think one of the things that's changed the dynamic and the negotiation process is just also there are a lot of new folks in this space, right? More people know what 14A is than ever before. I don't know if there's a listserv or something, but you see a lot more individual investors or folks who are kind of more on the anti-ESG side of it, coming in with proposals and maybe being less practiced in this space, right? Haven't been doing this for years, don't have the whole kind of approach of, okay, we're going to reach out and talk first, and if that doesn't work, maybe we'll do the proposal, or maybe we lob in the proposal and then we talk. So I think the process is just a little bit less tidy in some respects, and you have a lot more, again, new entrants to the process. And you have some folks who I think are using it maybe a little bit more as an avenue to get a spot at the annual meeting to say whatever it is they're going to say. So maybe those are not folks who are going to want to negotiate out a proposal necessarily, because the goal seems to be to be able to speak at the meeting, or to just kind of have that access. Or even if the proposal is going to get an incredibly low vote ultimately, you see some of these getting 2-3% votes, still is getting kind of that messaging out. So I think there's just a lot kind of, it's a more complicated process right now, and you don't kind of have that clear path that historically you did with a lot of the primary actors there. I don't know, Ade, do you want to talk at all about kind of that space?
Yeah, no, I think along those lines, and this is purely anecdotal, but having said that, I think I'm right. There seems to be a rise in the ineligible shareholder proponent, right? The proponent who is not unsophisticated, because they clearly know their way around the proxy rules, but they don't have and haven't provided, even after repeated requests, proper share ownership information to show that they're eligible to even bring a proposal. And after repeated requests, they still don't provide it, and there's no intention of withdrawing. And we have this experience now where we are also just in talking with people, as I say, anecdotally, this seems to be a not uncommon occurrence, where there's the ineligible shareholder proponent who is sticking with putting forth this proposal, probably knowing that it's going to get excluded, but in this means of like weaponizing shareholder proposals, they know it'll get excluded. However, that's after it's been put out there and the company has made a response seeking to reject it, and both their proposal and the company's response is out there. So, as I said, I mean, it's come up in enough conversations that it seems to be more than a coincidence, and it's with shareholder proponents who, again, don't seem unsophisticated. They certainly know how to submit a proposal. They certainly know how to make the arguments. They know the process. They're familiar with the process. So it's not that. It's not a lack of knowledge with respect to the rules. So, you know, kind of what's really going on here. And so, and I think that's maybe something to kind of keep an eye on as well too.
Definitely. Before we leave this space, I am just going to mention that there are pending 14.8 rule proposals around substantial implementation, duplication, and resubmissions. These are three of the substantive bases that companies can rely on to exclude a proposal. And these basically are tightening up the standards for staff consideration of whether a proposal has been substantially implemented. In other words, how close is it to whatever the company has done to substantially implement, how close is that to what is actually being asked for? And so under the proposal, you'd be looking at kind of the essential elements of the proposal and are all of those. So it's kind of going deeper into the proposal to the specific how, what, where, when is being asked for versus stepping back and looking at kind of the overall thrust of the proposal. And it's kind of a similar theme with duplication and resubmissions where you have to be kind of looking at the same subject matter, seeking the same objective by the same means. So it's a little bit less about where you're ending up. And if these are adopted as proposed, it'd be a little bit more about how you get there. So, you know, these are still pending. We will see, you know, the comment period is closed. The current reg flax agenda suggests that they, you know, are going to be considered for adoption in the fall. Of course, that's not an exact science, but it is still on the reg flax agenda. And I guess I'll just say, I think these are kind of, in a way, codifying a shift. And I think Kate had mentioned some of the tightening up just through the staff no action letters already, without rulemaking even, tightening up around substantial implementation in particular. So, you know, we will see where this lands, but folks should just kind of have that back of mind that these are pending. So before we leave this topic area, does anyone have anything they wanted to say about shareholder proposals that they did not get to say?
Well, one last thing, you know, one of the things we've been asked, and I'm starting to see in some of the early proxy statements, is what was withdrawn? We'd never talked in our proxy about shareholder proposals received that were withdrawn. We have gotten those conversations, you know, the engagement conversations. So something we're considering, but just put it out there to look at some examples about disclosures around withdrawn proposals, which I think, Addie, then leads also to, you know, what's been excluded, and is that giving another avenue of, you know, attention to things that should never have been in your proxy in the first place.
Yeah, as you know, as we've all experienced, you see a proxy statement ultimately, and there's been a lot of activity leading up to that, right? It may have been withdrawn, maybe it was successfully excluded under no action relief. In that case, you know, but there's not kind of to date, you know, there's not a specific way we can look and say, okay, this was what went in, what didn't, and I think that's fine. But, right, like if it doesn't belong in the proxy, then maybe we don't need to spend time talking about it, but we'll see. Any final words? Okay. Moving on to boards, and there is a lot here as well, as Crystal previewed. Just continue to be a key area of focus, and one of the things that I think has been alluded to in the discussion so far, but just to kind of pull it out a little bit, is, you know, when we talk about ESG, G has always been around, right? We've always cared about that, and then we've spent a lot of time focused on the E and the S in the last couple of years, and we are seeing just a lot more G back, you know, a lot of focus on boards. Never went away, but we just spent a lot more time talking about the E and the S. So, but, you know, if you really drill down, there is still continued significant focus on, you know, diversity, tenure, expertise. So what is it that companies and their advisors should be thinking about, Crystal, going into this season, or in this season? I guess we're in it.
Yeah, on the point you were making, The reversion to more of the G, kind of a regression back to the middle. It's funny, what we've seen this proxy season is, engagements that previously, 90% were focused on ESG or more the E in the S. The proportion of the meeting that is spent on the board has gone up significantly. Now, that is for most companies the first agenda item for investors. And then it's not to say that environmental and social issues have completely gone away, but you can tell that it's very clear that it has absolutely been a shift back to the G in the board in particular, I would say. One of the things that it's really interesting to see is just the rise in director participation in engagements too. This is something that gives investors a real window into the board meeting or into the board and the individuals on that board. And we saw a real uptick. We actually thought that maybe it was plateauing around that 40-ish% or so. But we saw a pretty meaningful uptake. It's now more than half of the S&P 500 companies disclose that they have board participates in their engagement. And I think this is one, companies getting more comfortable with this practice. And then two, some of the largest asset managers specifically making the ask. One of the things that we saw for one of the large passive investors this year is not only were they making the ask, but they were also making an ask for a particular director. So chair of the Nom/Gov committee or chair of the audit committee. And I think what companies should take from that is they really are trying to use this as a window into the board, who these individuals are. That's more than just the black and white in the proxy, and they want to understand how boards think. I think you're hearing a lot more questions around board practices. Tell me about how you're thinking about succession planning. How are you thinking about the skills on your board as it relates to your strategy and how you look forward? How are you evaluating your board? There's a lot more open-ended questions where they really just want to hear a director talk. So for those of you who are going out there engaging, or if you're just starting a program in which you're incorporating a director, I think it's good to be really mindful that those are the type of questions that they're going to get. It's going to be the open-ended and really trying to understand how the board thinks about some of these matters. The other thing that is core to what we've been talking about here is the policies around that investors are tightening, developing, introducing around their director votes. This has always been a really powerful vote for investors, and over the past few years, we've really started to see the implementation of policies that are having a meaningful impact on director votes. And so overboarding, I think this is one of the areas in which investors, I would say broadly, are really focused on the time that directors have to fulfill their oversight duties at each of their companies. And it's not in peacetime, but they really frame it as if you're going through a crisis, if you're going through a challenging time, do you have a board that can be there and help the company navigate this? So they're really taking that approach to this oversight, and you're starting to see much more tightening of policies, also looking at chair roles, looking at chair of the audit committee, and having a different perspective on the time required from that. The other thing I would note is oversight of ESG. We've been talking a lot about how there isn't the umbrella ESG term used as much, or engagements aren't as focused on ESG, but it is absolutely still there. T. Rowe Price, it's here on the slide. T. Rowe Price adopted a policy last year that was going to look at ESG oversight. They ended up voting against over 1,000 directors last year for what they called failure of ESG oversight. So these policies have teeth, even if they're not talked about publicly, and I think it's something really to watch. And the other couple areas that I would say around the director policies are very much around diversity. I think this is another one where you're really seeing incremental moves around the requirements for diversity. And so the takeaway here is as you're going out and engaging, or as you're preparing for an annual meeting, really taking a look at the policies in place of your top investors, because they really are tightening these policies to drive meaningful votes. And I think they can catch companies off guard if you're not watching some of the changes there closely.
It does strike me that, I don't think being a director has ever been an easy job, but I guess I'll say it's not getting any easier. And so when you are looking at overboarding policies and some of the other policies, I think it's challenging, and it's a very challenging space right now to find directors who are willing to serve, have the bandwidth to serve, are going to meet the various policies, and then there are there are some kind of new considerations that we're seeing come out. For example, the SEC has been kind of focused on this space through a couple of different avenues. Some recent-ish comment letters around board oversight of risk, and Ade will tell us a little bit about that. But kind of the concepts of specialized directors that come out in the cyber and climate rule proposals, both of which ask for very, very detailed disclosure around oversight and the expertise of your directors. Do you have a cyber expert? Do you have a climate expert? So there are so many eyeballs in this space right now. So I just think it's really challenging. I think it's a hard time to be a director and to find a director. So do you want to talk at all about kind of what the SEC's been doing here?
Yeah, no, I mean, you're exactly right. I mean, there's a lot of focus now on directors, and we're back to focusing on board oversight, and we're back to focusing on risk oversight, et cetera, and who's doing that, and who are these individuals, and do they have the expertise, as you mentioned, Lily, in areas of risk that are a concern, whether it's cyber or whether it's climate. And it's kind of following what Crystal was saying too, with respect to institutional investors. There has been this focus and an increasing focus on the SEC with respect to that very issue. And so, in addition to the proposed rules, we also saw last year a number of companies just receiving comment letters with respect to board leadership structures and risk oversight. That sort of went beyond, just SK 407H and asked such questions or such comments as expand your discussions with respect to the reason the company believes that leadership structure is appropriate, or explain the role of the lead independent director and the independent chair of the board. Explain if the board has a vote with respect to overriding its CEO or their chair with respect to risk matters. There were questions on risk oversight. Consider the role of the board in providing risk oversight. Disclose the time frame over which the company evaluates risks, et cetera. There are a series of questions the staff issued. But I think that the takeaway here was that they were looking for more than just boilerplate disclosure in response to the requirements of SK 401 or 407H, right? They were really trying to delve deep and get a better understanding and better disclosure around board leadership structures, risk oversight structures. And so it's in addition to the institutional investors that we're talking about, it's in addition to the activists and such, looking and trying to attack perhaps a lack of expertise or perhaps a lack of sufficient oversight as a means. You also have the SEC focusing on this area as well too. So it's really a lot of eyes, on boards right now.
Just as a reminder for folks, this was a letter that went out to however many companies, and it was essentially a futures comment on proxy disclosures, and really gets pretty deep into the weeds on kind of governance oversight matters. And the response from the staff was very clear that we're not expecting us to tell you what your disclosure is going to be in the proxy. We understand things will change between now and then, but please tell us you will consider that. Not everyone got this letter, but everyone is aware of it. And so, for public companies who got the letter, probably feel like they probably have a little bit of a head start in thinking about what they feel like they need to change in response to the letter. And then everyone else is kind of saying, okay, well, what was addressed in this letter? How do my current disclosures compare to this? And the disclosures requested are pretty in the weeds. I mean, some of them are maybe not areas that you're going to see even in a very expansive and thorough discussion. I mean, folks have a lot of this disclosure right now, but is asking to go pretty far beyond that in some cases. So it's something that I am assuming those of you who are in-house are thinking about a little bit as you, as you draft your proxies or finalize them, as the case may be. I mean, how are you all thinking about it?
And that, by the way, that's even for the companies who didn't get the letters,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Those who didn't get the letters, everyone is sort of examining, re-examining their disclosures and their proxies to see if it should fit or if it would fit now in this sort of new regime in light of the comments that were issued. So.
Yeah, this is an example of one of those letters that goes out to however many companies, and then everyone else kind of is expected to follow a little bit. But I don't know, Colleen, how have you been kind of thinking about this enhanced focus going into this season?
It's a great question, and I guess I'd start with the strategy. So it's risk oversight, and we have to marry it up with the strategy, and so we take a step back and look at the strategy, look at our board members, look at their skills, and make sure that the skills are aligning to the strategy, so that you then have oversight. Is the committee structure right? So we've taken a look at making sure that we're focused on the right things. So those key risks that the company faces, is there a committee focused on them? The Boeing case, right? To look at that. And then how are we describing it? So one of the earlier panels, right, they talked about boilerplate. So we try to refresh that disclosure and look at it, even if nothing's changed, just to make sure that we've taken a look at it and are we telling the story the best way. It has come up a lot this year. So our off-season engagement was very focused on sort of bread and butter board governance, and risk oversight was one of those things, and not on a specific topic. Just in general, they wanted to talk broadly about risk oversight. So I think that as we look at the universal proxy card and how that's going to influence things, it really is becoming essential to focus on risk, that we tell the story about our board, why the board governance structure for us, we have an independent chair, why that works for us, why it's the right decision for us, how that plays into that, what the board engagement is like, how they work together, and how the committee structure flows. And if we tell that story right, then we should be okay at the end, right, as we get the vote.
And I would just add, I think that's so much easier said to try to get below the boilerplate than done, because we've struggled. We've sometimes in the past, I've looked at our disclosure, I've thought we've put our personal touches on it for what the company was doing, and then I'll pull up 2 or 3 other proxies and realize we're all saying the same thing. So I actually understand where the investors are coming from, where they're saying it all feels like it's boilerplate, even though sometimes for the companies we feel like we're doing our best to actually try to explain it. And for the top couple of investors where they can call a director and speak to the director and get a little bit more of the feel for what's going on in the room, that's great. But trying to bring it to life for all shareholders and putting it in the proxy, I think, is a challenge we'll continue to face. And so thinking about board oversight risk, at my company we get a lot of questions about just independence and making sure that we're able to really talk through the skill sets, the composition, but also the oversight of management and the level of engagement and independence overall, and just making sure that there's a way to bring all of the great work that our board does into the proxy and being able to describe it. It's a challenge.
Lily, one thing, if you're thinking about bringing a board member to a meeting, please make sure they're prepared. As I'm thinking about risk, right? That's a double-edged sword for you, and just the way you prepare, or I assume everyone prepares, for any question that you may get during a shareholder engagement call, spend that time. You probably need a prep session with that director. Make sure you bring in the right director. So, is it your lead independent director, your independent chair, the chair of your compensation committee, and they should be able to have the high-level discussion about any of those issues. And I think it's okay for them to then pivot and kind of a nuts and bolts question to me as the corporate secretary, to the HR person who's there from executive compensation or to IR. But they're not just air traffic control, and you certainly don't want your investors to walk away thinking that the board member doesn't have a handle on what they're doing. And so a prep session is really valuable.
Absolutely. Just coming back to one last kind of topic here, and this comes back to the identification or the disclosure that's been proposed around whether or not companies have a climate expert or a cyber expert. I know that this is a topic, of significant focus for boards right now. It has, it's kind of ramped up. How much do we want our members to be specialized? We do have this potential, if adopted as proposed, disclosure requirement about whether we have an expert in cyber, an expert in climate. Any thoughts on kind of how boards are navigating the balance between kind of general oversight and not ending up with a board that is comprised of specialists who kind of maybe are not going to have the big picture. Maybe they will, that would be great. But how you're thinking about whether to have specialists on the board or bring in that expertise some other way.
Happy to start on that one. So we just added a new board member in September, and as we looked for that board member, it was very clear that we wanted somebody with a focus. We were looking for somebody who had clinical expertise, but who could add at every board discussion. So our Nom and Gov committee is really looking for board members who can contribute no matter what the topic is. And you don't want somebody just to sit there and they only be able to speak either at one committee meeting or on one topic that's presented over the course of the day. So finding those, directors who have other experiences through business or, through other work that they've done is really key to making sure then you've got the right engagement and breadth of experiences and discussions. So we don't want a series of silos and experts in only one thing sitting around the table. I don't think that works. So we've asked, for example, for our directors to tell us about their experiences in cyber and climate as we've, thought about the future disclosures that might be needed rather than asking the single question, are you an expert? It's been interesting.
Yeah, I would echo that entirely. And, there's a real downside to having too many just siloed experts around the board, which is that when that topic comes up, all the other directors check out and say, well, that's, Director X's area of responsibility. They're the experts. I'm just going to defer to what they say. And I think then you start not having the most effective dialogue and discussion at the board level. And so, industry experience is very helpful and important, and it's good to have that. And it's also good to balance that out with more general experience of a lot of, the seasoned directors or other perspectives that are brought to the table, like Colleen was talking about. And that mix and that balance is very important. And so there could be some companies where they are going to want to have a cyber expert because it's their industry, it's their, it's their business, it gets back to their strategy. And so, for me and for us, I always think you have to look at the company strategy, you have to look at what you're, where you're going, you have to look around the table and look at all the different experiences that everybody brings, and then see when you're looking to add a new director or looking around to see is this the right board, are there gaps, and are those gaps things where you need a new director to come on board, or for maybe a climate or other type of very specialized issue that maybe not as directly relevant to some of the, the core work and the industry work, is that something where you can just educate your directors and bring in an outside expert and up-level their level of education, and then they can engage with the experts at the company and the experts outside the company to be able to then fulfill all their responsibilities on the board, ask the right questions, oversee the risk, and be fluent in all of that, even if they're not individual experts.
Excellent. Okay, we're going to take it home with discussion of shareholder activism and engagement. And before people worry, did Lily go rogue and decide she's just going to do the activism panel and didn't like Brian and Michelle and the others that much? Anyway, we're not going to do that. We're just going to kind of stay in our lane and touch on it in the context of kind of how folks are thinking about the annual meeting season, and particularly just kind of how ESG is playing into the calculation. So I'm going to let Crystal start us off here in terms of continuing the discussion of trends this season and how ESG is fitting into this picture.
Yeah, well, we'll continue with the theme of things that are going to be brand new for this year. And I know the activism panel is going to spend a lot of time on this, but we're coming off of 2022 was one of the most challenging equity markets in recent history, and there's a lot of companies that have more depressed valuation, and that's a ripe opportunity for activists, right? At the end of the day, activists are deep value investors. They're looking for undervalued companies that they can come in and grow that value. And so the opportunity set for activism is absolutely there, and we're seeing a lot more activity, even if it's not public, kind of under the service. But on this question around tying it back to everything that we've talked about this year, the implementation of universal proxy card this year is an absolute game changer for not only fights, but how investors are thinking about the board. It goes to all the shifts that we've been seeing in where investors are spending their time to really understand who is on that board and understand how boards think about their collective set of experiences and specialization as boards are putting together the right collection of people. I think one of the things that we don't anticipate being as much in play from an ESG standpoint or our E and S fights. I think last year, coming off of a particular fight last year, I think it was a really clear message from investors that an E and S fight without an economic argument is a really challenging one for an activist, and I think that pushes activism back squarely into the more traditional activism that you see, where there is a clear economic argument to impact value, and then paired with the governance hook. So whether that's around the board composition or other governance activities or risks that an activist will point out to create that doubt about the existing board. I think we really see that coming back to the forefront. But I do think that universal proxy card, I know we're going to get to this in a minute, is very much impacting not just proxy fights and how they're going to play out and the calculus that goes into that, but very much impacting the way investors are looking to understand boards and the way companies need to be preparing to talk about their board, even for companies who don't have a fight. Hopefully nobody has a fight, but the impact of this change is one that I think all companies are going to feel as they talk about their boards.
So again, we aren't going to kind of front run the universal proxy discussion, but it is kind of a key thing that is different this year for companies as they're kind of going into this season. And just kind of as a reminder, this is a rule change that it's not kind of changing the underlying right to nominate someone. It is causing all sets of all nominees to appear together on both the company's proxy card and the dissident's proxy card. But everyone is still sending their same proxy in some form, questions about how much of a burden that may or may not be for dissidents under this system. But it is kind of a disclosure layer on top of an existing right that exists under state law and that's set out in the company's governing document. So it'll be very, very interesting to see. I mean, and it's an important change, and we will see how that plays out this season. This is our first season with it, so we'll see how it kind of plays out. But Adi, do you want to kind of talk about how you're seeing clients plan for this? Do we, and Crystal referred to this, do we think that the social and governance-focused investors are going to utilize it? We've heard from some that they're thinking about using it as a tool to kind of enforce winning shareholder proposals. How do you see people thinking about this, your clients?
Yeah, no, I think it's as Crystal said, right? It helps with this push of G in the ESG, to these fights, right? Now you've got universal proxy, you can have split ticket voting, so it's no longer a battle of, my slate against yours. It's looking at individual directors, and so now individual directors are going to get increased scrutiny. Are you, individual? Are you a proper fit for this board? Or are you vulnerable? And so there's, in terms of prepping boards, in addition to just helping them understand what the universal proxy is. For many directors who may not have even experienced a contest, now experiencing a universal proxy contest, what it is and what that means and what the proxy card is going to look like, et cetera, and going through all of that and the changes to the proxy card and such. There's also an education with respect to this shift to more of an individual focus, and what that means to to you personally. Now expect more scrutiny on an individual level, whether it's from ISS and Glass Lewis, who may look at particular directors, or whether it's from the activists themselves who are looking to kind of pick off one or two people, and you're not falling into that vulnerable bucket. I think the first thing we're educating them on is that sort of that shift in focus. So now in terms of preparing the proxy itself, right? Board composition, your skills, vulnerabilities, evaluating that, addressing that, showing why this is the proper board, why this is, individually and as a board, why this is, the best composition for this company becomes all the more important. So what those disclosures look like, we need to spend more time on that. I think Universal Proxy also changes just, the annual meeting timeline. There's the expectation that, if to the extent that there is a contest, that these contests may begin earlier. There are, deadlines within Universal Proxies, which, the other panel will discuss as well too, but note that within the rules themselves that may push up, where these contests come. There are other forces that may drive potential activists to bring contests earlier. And then it also sort of changes the timing of your discussions with shareholders and your shareholder engagement calendar as well too. So there's that, as well as within those discussions themselves too, kind of also thinking about now more of a focus on addressing and spending time discussing these issues that are important to those those investors that are in your stock. Discussions that may not have gone on as long in prior years. So we're advising companies to expect that as well, to look out for that as well too.
I mean, taking it from an all or nothing proposition, right? Whichever, picking one card or the other. I mean, it makes it a lot more personal, right? And
Yeah.
Going back to my theme of being a director is hard. I mean, if you're putting yourself out there, you may now, you have to be concerned, right? That you may be someone who's targeted, and that's a really personal thing, and directors have never liked getting withhold votes, and this can kind of, so I mean, again, it remains to be seen how this gets used. We have heard, kind of some of the social and governance folks kind of saying this could be an enforcement tool. As folks know, shareholder proposals right now are almost exclusively non-binding in nature. So the kind of the stick on those is potentially negative proxy advisory firm recommendations if you don't act on one of these. And so the question is, will this be a new stick in that regard? Will it be kind of used by non-traditional activists? So I am one who kind of thinks we kind of gird up and just see how the season goes before we panic. But it is a significant change, and we'll see how it plays out. And if nothing else, it's just introducing a whole nother area of something to worry about and think about going into this season. Just so folks know, I was authorized by our fearless leader, Tom, to go to 2:35 because we started a few minutes late, but we are kind of in our close to wrap up stage. One of the kind of just as a last kind of a last call are there kind of things that you all are thinking about in-house in this space that you want to touch on, or otherwise we can move on from this either way? Good. Okay. Crystal, do you have thoughts on it? We good? We're good? Okay. Yes? No? Okay. All right. I do want to just kind of one last thing, and I feel like it always gets a little bit short shrift, but we have mentioned proxy advisory firms. Each year they update their policies. And so we're not going to go through in painful detail for many reasons, including time. But that's not the only reason. But anything folks should kind of be thinking about in this regard coming into this season with the policies that apply for 2023 meetings.
Yeah, no, there have been some updates and some revisions. We've got a list of quite a few of the policies up there now. As I mentioned, there have been a couple revisions and updates as well too. I think one significant thing is ISS and Glass Lewis's climate risk mitigation policies, for companies that are in the Climate Action 100 Plus focus group. So that's a potentially new significant thing that we can't really get into within the 15 seconds we're devoting to this, but
You can have 30 seconds.
this is there. This is there. You should know that that's there. You should know that these, that you should take a look at these policies. I know we always shortchange this, but you should take a look and you should see, just review what the revisions are for 2023.
I mean, overall, it was
Yeah.
somewhat incremental, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so, it's always good to kind of get the updates. In some cases, ISS will make a change on topic, Class won't, and vice versa. So pretty incremental. I mean, Crystal, do you see anything pushing it, and anything on kind of institutional investor policies you want to flag?
No, I would agree. I think the proxy advisor policies are very much more incremental, and I actually think the biggest change with the institutional policies were tightening around some of the director policies that we talked through, particularly on overboarding and what they're looking for there. It really was the biggest shifts I think we saw.
All right, we are at the speed round for takeaways. I'll start with you since you're sitting next to me. I'm sorry. Crystal, what's your final word? Yeah, you won't do it again, will you?
So I think say on pay could be a little bit of a sleeper issue this proxy season. Again, kind of going back to the market that we're in, it's probably the worst performing market for 2022 since the implementation of say on pay in 2011. And I know that means for a lot of boards and comp committees, as you're looking at TSR, as you're looking at underlying financial performance, they may not be in harmony. And so I do think that this is one of the things that this year investors are going to be looking for executives' experience to align with their experience. And I don't know whether that's always going to be the case, because underlying financial performance at a lot of companies was very strong. And if you think about what's driving compensation programs, there's a lot in there. And the other piece that gets tied into that is you're seeing a lot more focus on target setting, the rigor of target setting. And so I could see a little bit more scrutiny just because of some of the changes in businesses and industries as you're coming off of COVID and this year that we had last year. So this is one thing that, it hasn't been getting a lot of attention, but I do think this could be a sleeper issue. Some of this say on performance voting as opposed to say on pay.
Colleen?
Governance is back. That's what I can say. I'm very excited that governance is back, and each off-season has its own flavor. And I think we went through a human capital management, social issues, particularly during COVID, and particularly as a healthcare company. But now we're really back to sort of bread and butter governance, and transparency and disclosure is going to be really important.
Back to you.
I piggyback on what Colleen said as well too. I mean, I think the theme of a lot of what we were saying today is, sort of a focus or a refocus on board composition, board oversight, the skills of individual members, the overall, skills and oversight quality of the board is now, a focus, and it's coming from different areas, whether it's from, or pushes from different areas, whether it's universal proxy or the SEC's rules or activists and or the whole host of matters that we sort of addressed today. We're back to, board composition and skills.
All right, Kate, close us out.
I'm going to be the broken record and say, just with, again, that focus on board and coming down to the disclosure, I used to wonder who ever read all of our proxy disclosure. And I think right now we're seeing the importance of being able to really get your story in there and speak to the individual directors, speak to their oversight, speak to their independence. And so I would come back to governance disclosure.
Well, thank you all, and thank you all for your attention. Have a great afternoon.